Great. Well, good morning, DeSci London. How are we doing? It's really awesome and a privilege to hopefully help open up the conference today. And thanks so much, Alfie and Julia and the whole team here at DeSci London for organizing such an awesome event on a beautiful day. I think the sun came out just for us here in London. As the team mentioned, my name is Alok Tai. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vibe Bio. We are working in the DeSci space, and we're a fairly young project, but excited to sort of share with you a little bit about both myself as well as Vibe, and more importantly, about DeSci as a whole. And I think the opportunity it provides to you as scientists, builders, patients even, and the opportunity to hopefully advance the field. So today, I really want to share with you kind of our perspective from a non-technical standpoint, really, of what decentralized science is, and specifically crafted around the lens of an entrepreneurial scientist. Before I get into sort of the meat of the talk, would love to just maybe see it from a show of hands, the background of folks who are in the audience. How many folks are sort of scientists sort of by trade and training? All right, that's about 70, maybe 80%. All right, great. How many folks are sort of Web3, blockchains, or software by background? Okay, about 20%. How many folks are sort of maybe part of a patient advocacy group or a patient themselves? All right, some representation. All right, great, cool. Thanks so much for indulging me on that. Always helpful to sort of see who's kind of in the audience.
What about data engineers? Investors.
VCs, do they really count? I don't know.
Data engineers. Yeah.
Data engineers.
Experimental data engineers.
Cool. So. Yeah, I think we'll, okay, how many data engineers? You want to raise your hands? No? Okay, all right, cool. So, it's great to see sort of who's in the room. Just maybe to sort of anchor the conversation, I wanted to sort of share with you a little bit about my background. So I personally, as I mentioned, I'm a scientist. I actually spent about 15 years at the bench doing research at a bunch of different institutions in the States. I spent a lot of time at the bench wrestling with experiments and liquids and measurements and trying to publish and eventually become an academic. But as life does, ended up actually moving to the software world and moved out of academia into building software companies specifically for the biotech industry. I was really fortunate over the past decade and change to build a couple software companies that worked basically through the whole range of drug development, from R&D through clinical development to regulatory. Those companies have gone on to raise about $100 million in venture capital, a few hundred employees, and are doing pretty well. But I think as life does, you get thrown a curveball from time to time. About a year and a half ago, my wife and I were fortunate enough to have our first kid. Though the pregnancy went okay, unfortunately, our daughter was born very sick and spent a long time in the hospital. Even though we lived in Boston with phenomenal medical care and phenomenal insurance, we were in a scenario where our daughter's diseases, though common and the biology well understood, unfortunately had no dedicated therapeutic options available to her. And as a consequence, she spent a long time suffering. So that's her sort of at day 3 or 4 of life, sort of in the middle there. Having been a scientist and now the parent of the patient, it was really surprising in a circumstance when we had such depth of understanding of the biology. Tens of thousands of people suffered from her diseases on an annualized basis in the US alone. It was really surprising why we didn't have treatments or even anything in development for her. And so it became a passion and an obsession for me to try to understand why in this circumstance where we have a fundamental underpinnings for finding treatments, why those don't actually exist. And as we started to pull back the onion, whether it be with biotech VCs or with drug developers or with academics, it became clearer and clearer that there was a circumstance where we should be able to do this. Over $1 trillion a year globally is spent on medicines, and there's tens of millions of really bright scientists, much like many of you, all across the globe working on different facets of science and drug development. But when you actually start to look at the structure of the biopharmaceutical industry, what we start to see is that in the landscape of overall disease, the vast majority of organizations and pharmaceutical and biotech companies end up focusing on a fairly small subset of the overall disease landscape. And the reason for that is that ultimately the types of projects that they invest in and focus in on are those that often are underpinned by perhaps a broader technology platform, have an existing market, as well as have an existing sales and distribution methodology that they can align to. Unfortunately, that often relegates the industry to a fairly small number of diseases, perhaps a few hundred. But for those diseases like that my daughter has, as well as millions of others all across the globe, there's many that end up being overlooked. But the unique opportunity that I think exists here is that in a circumstance where we understand the biology, there exists a measurable amount of unmet medical need, and there's no existing competitive threat at the moment, I think there's an opportunity to actually expand and extend the aperture of drug development and be able to reliably and scalably, hopefully, go after the 13,000 plus diseases that are out there. And so I think ultimately the core of making that a reality has to be empowering both scientists, like those of you in the room, as well as patients to collaborate together to make that happen. Now, fundamentally, when you start to look at how this process happens today, there's a tremendous amount of challenges for folks in your shoes. Now, for those of you who perhaps come from an academic science background are probably familiar with the fact that there's a limited amount of capital and funding out there to be able to actually bring your ideas to reality. So in the context of drug development, where you start in basic science, you advance into preclinical development, ultimately to a clinical trial step, and then hopefully to patients, what we often see is that the current modes of funding, whether it be academic science and grants, or even charities and donations, often end up carrying that work only to a certain point where it often hits what's known as the valley of death, which is that transition from going from an animal into a human. And so what we've also seen is that when you start to try and get medicines into patients and into people, which I think is the real aspiration of what I was trying to do, and I think what a lot of the DeSci space aspires, is that you actually need a very different pool of capital, expertise, and tools to actually be able to bring those medicines into people. So that's the fundamental, I think, operating principles that we start to see as being really critical in the DeSci space, and we think DeSci is in a unique place to be able to go solve that. So ultimately, in our view, decentralized science is about bringing together and solving those challenges that relate to people and expertise, capital and access, as well as tools and coordination. And ultimately, what we're starting to see manifest is that in this world, especially one that's highly global, highly digital, those three things come together in the form of a community. And some of the things that Alfie sort of mentioned that DeSci London is trying to do here, I think are great examples of how they can bring people and tools and capital together to help unlock these sort of innovations. But imagine now if it could be done at a global scale or in very specific areas based on interest. And so what we've started to see more and more now is that this community that brings together these three components can also start to do really exciting things, whether it be to ideate around ways in which to solve important problems like diseases and come up with new types of concepts, help evaluate and provide feedback on some of those ideas, as well as even start to match individuals to start to actually launch projects and start to develop these candidate products. But ultimately, I think those components of the community that I think differentiate from what we've seen today really stem from a component of openness, as well as an importance of having credibility at the table as well, because as we aspire to take these technologies and bring them to the real world, I think that's another piece that's going to be really important. And so DeSci as a whole, I'd like to think actually draws inspiration from a lot of the ways in which, let's take medicines as an example, have been developed in the past half century. In many circumstances where medicines perhaps weren't developed by pharma or biotech VCs, they were actually developed by partnerships that formed between entrepreneurial scientists and patients. Some of the most transformative medical outcomes have actually emerged from these sorts of communities. So whether it's the vaccine for polio, many of the treatments for cystic fibrosis, or even forms of hypertension, it was actually patients or individual scientists who actually came together to be able to advance, invest, and develop these candidate medicines. One of the most interesting ones that I think that's on this slide that you might all find inspiration in is the work of Martine Rothblatt, an electrical engineer whose daughter was diagnosed with a rare disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension. She went and herself licensed a drug from GSK, developed it, and today that company has, I think, a market cap of about $15 billion. It does about $1.5 billion in top line revenue. And so in each of these individual circumstances, not only is the science transformative and the medicine transformative, but also the financial outcomes have been massive as well, where you have unicorn-like outcomes that emerge from this sort of style of development. And in my view, one of the key things that's made this a reality has been the fundamental superpowers that these constituents bring to the table. Especially when it comes to working with patients, which is sort of near and dear to my heart, obviously. I think a key part of it becomes those patients can help support, drive urgency and focus for the organization, can help with key bottlenecks, whether it be regulatory or clinical trials or otherwise, and I think becomes a new adjacent approach to what we can do today. And so I want to sort of, again, paint this picture that though we can talk about disruption and wax poetic about tearing down existing infrastructure and systems, I really think what DeSci offers is a new adjacent approach that allows us to bring, again, these tools to the table of, again, tools, capital, expertise to empower folks like yourselves and other communities to develop the products and the medicines that they care about. And so I think the folks at Ultra Rare Bio did a really awesome job of actually now mapping this landscape and all the different projects and ideas that have since emerged here. And so you can see from this slide, and having been in this space for about a year and a half now, this slide was maybe 1/4 the size just a year and a half ago. We're seeing really exponential growth in what openness enables when it comes to empowering, again, scientists, communities, patients to go realize their own visions. So whether it be in the areas of academic publishing, to finance, to biotech, I think you're seeing a lot of really exciting projects, many of which are represented here today at DeSci London, as coming to the forefront to sort of chart this new territory. So I think it's safe to say that when you spend time with your peers here today and tomorrow, that the feeling that you get is one of optimism, is one of an eye on the future, as opposed to sort of being held back by the challenges of the past. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just sort of sharing with you a little bit about our perspective and lens at BioBio. What we're doing is we're trying to build what we call the Bell Labs for biotech, where we want to empower a community of both patients and scientists to be able to help develop new medicines. And we personally are focused on this facet of medicines with a real key initial interest in the rare disease space because of the challenges I've seen and the prominence of the community in that domain. But our hope is truly to be able to create this community and empower it to be able to come up with new ideas to solve these key diseases, help evaluate and provide feedback, and ultimately empower connections between individuals and empower them with tools, capital, and expertise to realize those solutions. As an organization, we've now been around for about a few months. We launched earlier in 2022. Have now also brought in several dozen proposals across different facets of therapies in the rare disease space and are actively sort of working through setting some of these up. One of the examples that I'll sort of share is with a rare neurodegenerative disease called Lafora disease. One of our first partners was with a patient advocacy group called Chelsea's Hope. Chelsea's Hope is a US-based organization that's focused on finding a cure for Lafora. Now you can think of Lafora as basically Alzheimer's, but for children. A genetic mutation in terms of how glycogen is managed in the body results in the buildup of these plaques, glycogen plaques that build up in the brain. Unfortunately, after a child is diagnosed with that disease, within about a handful of years, they pass. And it's a fairly painful and gruesome death that results in memory loss, paralysis, seizures, etc. Unfortunately, no treatment for Lafora exists today, and despite interest in this space, multiple big pharma companies and academic institutions have yet to be able to get a medicine into a clinical trial. So having partnered with this community and seeing an opportunity by which we can bring these principles of expertise, capital, and tooling to the table, we partnered with Chelsea's Hope to be able to help them identify and advance a medicine for the disease, for Lafora disease specifically. So over the past few months, we've brought over a dozen different experts to the table with drug development experience, having launched multi-billion-dollar drugs like Spinraza, Velcade, Brineura, amongst others. We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars and soon millions of dollars to be able to both identify and evaluate high potential medicines specifically in this space, and have now started to bring modern tools, whether it be machine learning driven design or RNA-based medicines to now evaluate the right potential path to find a cure for Lafora. And so when we start to think about kind of what the potential is here, our community is really keen to be able to try and drive that first community-driven therapeutic specifically for this disease, and hopefully show what this broader model and process is in the real world for real patients. So, as I sort of wrap up here, my hope is to be able to paint a picture for you that though it might be bleak in academia and the scientific world and the public markets are in a highly volatile state, I think there is a huge opportunity for you as individuals and us as a community to be part of this new movement of decentralized science and to really truly enable a true global collective of patients, scientists, and investors. And so ultimately, what I think Web3 especially has shown us is that if you can truly bring together this vibrant, committed community, there ends up becoming resources and capital available to you. If you're able to bring capital to the table, especially in this domain, you can actually invest and actually own both the output and the work that's created as a community. If that community has ownership, the community can also lead then the distribution and the access to that technology, and then ultimately also the underlying infrastructure. So hopefully I want to just leave on a positive note here and give you a sense of sort of what the future portends, but it's really going to be built based on the contributions of everybody as opposed to a select few. So would love to also continue the conversation on DeSci and these other topics. Vibe and our team is really excited to be able to sponsor tonight's happy hour. So if anyone here likes beer, which I'm told many in the UK do, we're hosting a happy hour at the Lighterman at 6:30 tonight. We're also running a workshop tomorrow on operationalizing these DeSci principles. So if you are working on an interesting disease area or have an interesting science that you want to pursue, we'll actually have a live case study with a real life project that we can workshop together as a team. And then lastly, and most importantly, we'd also love to have you as part of our community. And so, use the QR code and you can sign up for our community and our colleagues will follow up. So thank you all so much.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Great presentation, Alok. John Cumbers, Sin Bio Beta. I'd like to know if you could access any of the funding agencies and think about a shift in their mindset about supporting DeSci and seeing DeSci as something that is collaborative and additive to their funding pool rather than trying to replace it. Who would you like to access and to get advocates, and what would the titles of those people be?
Yeah, I think let me give you a style of the persona that I think could be really important here, which is when you look at the overall funding landscape today, I think capital is, individuals who receive capital will do what the capital expects of them. And when you look at least I'm going to use the States as an example, just because it's what I'm most familiar with and where I'm from, but there's projects like ARPA-H, DARPA, BARDA, where unlike traditional funding institutions like the NIH or the FDA or the NSF, they play very early stage, and their mandate is risk and platform. And I think those are perhaps the types of folks, whether it's at the program management level or the director level in those sorts of institutions, that I think are the perfect complement, because they like to take big swings, they think in collaboration, and also the investments that they're making are intended to be platform type investments, right? What I think is really critical out of platform, especially from a software perspective, is the opportunity for others to take advantage of it in a composable way to solve the problem that they care about. And I think that's really where the complementary nature of funding and intent happens with DeSci.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Don't be shy. I even have a box which I'm told is a microphone I can throw at you. Got a question? I'm not just going to throw it anyway, but okay. Well, oh yeah, there are some questions. Right, should I? You know what? I'll pass it along because I think it's too early to start throwing. Feel free to throw it.
For you don't need a microphone. Hey.
Thank you, Alok, for the talk. So, I mean, one thing that I'm still struggling to understand is how will this model change the landscape for, like, in terms of the funding landscape with charities, for example? Is it going to be a competitor, or is it going to be a collaborator, or maybe like it's even more than that? That maybe all of them will basically go towards this direction, especially in eliminating bureaucracy within their organizations and so on. So what are your views on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm going to give you a similar answer to kind of John's point on the government side, which is I think it's going to be a very highly collaborative relationship. So for example, the work that we're doing with Chelsea's Hope, as well as a few dozen other patient advocacy groups, they're all charities, and they all accept donations from their communities and people that they spend time with. And I think, again, the intent to participate or support a charity is very different, I think, than one when you're supporting, say, a DAO or a token or a crypto, a DeSci project. And so I think it's actually going to be highly complementary. You look at the quantity of capital that's available from a donation standpoint. Again, the intent and the origins are very different than the $1 trillion plus pool of capital available in crypto. And I think the opportunity here is that the risk tolerance is also very different. One of the things I often talk about when it comes to building Vibe, and one of the common questions is, why do you build it as a DAO? Why are you doing it with Web3? I think ultimately there is a large pool of highly risk tolerant people in the Web3 space who want to take big swings. That is the ethos of Web3, right? And I think that is highly different than a grant funding agency, a charity, a biotech VC, as an example. So I think it is almost always going to be a highly complementary scenario. And I think charities, especially in current times, can see it as an adjacent pool of capital and expertise that allows to support them in their mission, but also helps give them visibility into a much broader pool of ideas, personnel, and tools to be able to realize sort of their goals as well. So I really, really think we as a community should reinforce the idea of collaboration and as opposed to competition in this case.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for like one more question if anyone else has one and you want to throw the box. Come on, don't be shy. Any more questions behind you?
For the talk, that was very interesting. Have you had any experience working with universities and traditional academic institutions directly, and how have you found that experience?
Yeah, so we have. A part of it comes from, say, some of the technologies developed at a university, trying to license them out. That's been sort of one of the aspects of the experience. The other is, we've built a scientific advisory board of Nobel laureates and a few other successful people who've come from academia. So we've sort of seen it from a different perspectives and lenses. I think where our interface with them in part comes from is that there is an overlap where much of the excitement that comes from academia still has quite a ways to go before it can sort of reach a commercial point or tap a more traditional source of capital. And so we become, I think, this really interesting partner to hopefully help one, surface up ideas that are interesting. Second, connect those ideas with high potential needs, like specific diseases that weren't initially considered. And then third is sort of provide that infrastructure of expertise, capital, tools to help bridge that and show that those technologies and ideas can actually solve a problem. As you probably know, I'm assuming you're a scientist by background, right? As you probably know, a lot of that work happens sort of at the lab and PI level as opposed to the broader institution. And so those are sort of been some of the ways that we've interacted with them. But I sort of see those partnerships and relationships sort of growing and scaling from there.
Great, thank you so much, everybody. Right, so next up, thank you, Alok, very much.
Thank you.